Welcome to Darshan Talks, powered by the Kulkarni Law Firm. This podcast explores the challenges and opportunities facing FDA-regulated companies. Join us as we discuss the latest trends, news, and insights with experts and executives in the field.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. Recording this because this is a really interesting conversation that I've never had before in terms of recording it and sharing it. It's one of those conversations that people talk behind the scenes, but it's good to get this on the record so that we can talk a little bit about it. So if you're in the life sciences, one of the key components of what you end up doing is negotiating clinical trial agreements. And one of the things I've never actually seen anyone talk about is what rules are you really susceptible to that you're really thinking about when you are negotiating these agreements. And you can come at it from a site perspective, a CRO perspective, a sponsor perspective. We have Ish here who actually has significant amount of experience talking about it from the site perspective. And I'm going to let him first introduce himself. So Ish, over to you.
Thanks, Darshan. Istvan Fekete. Everybody, feel free to call me Ish. That's what everybody ends up doing. I've been negotiating clinical trial agreements for over a decade at this point. I used to run the contracts office at the University of Chicago. And about 4 years ago, I had a buddy who came over to Huron Consulting Group because Huron was building a outsourcing arm of their higher education practice where institutions could outsource certain research administration functions. And one of the service lines they wanted to build was for research contracts. And I said to myself, boy, half the time I've been running my office here at U of C, I've been understaffed. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a service like this out there? And so I said, I'm not only a customer, but I'm also the president, or however that commercial goes. And I decided to come over here and give that a shot. And so I've been building that service line for the last 4 years. And, at this point, I've had the pleasure of personally negotiating clinical trial agreements for 20 to 30 sites somewhere in there across the country.
So you primarily work with large academic institutions, often known as academic research institutions. In your experience, do they have different considerations than, say, a small doctor's office?
Absolutely. I think academic institutions always have this requirement that the knowledge that they are producing in the projects that they engage in be brought to the public. And so when you're dealing with academic institutions, publications are going to be an issue that is way, way, way more important to them than it is going to be to a physician's group. And along those lines, because of their tax-exempt municipal bond financing and otherwise, they also have a vested interest in drawing perhaps tighter parameters around intellectual property. And when it comes to the data generated in the study, they're comfortable with the sponsor owning the data, but they're going to require an internal non-commercial research and education license to it, in addition to the right to publish on the results of the study. So there are definitely unique aspects in terms of where the priorities lie when you're dealing with an academic institution versus a physician's group.
What I really like is this part you brought up, because I've heard of it numerous times. I've worked with academic institutions, but I want to dig into it a little bit further. You talked about this need that that academic institutions in general have around making sure that the research is published. What are the rules that play into that? Like, what is actually causing it? Is it more of a we think that that's the interest, that is the point of an academic institution, or is there an actual law that requires it?
It's both. It's both. So we do think that the mission of the academic institution is to bring knowledge to the public, right? And so if academic institutions are engaged in research projects, and whether you want to call a clinical trial a research project or not, I think we could have a conversation about that. But from the academic institution side, there is a research component to it. And when you're engaged in research, your mission is to bring what you learn through doing that research to the public so that the public can benefit from it, other researchers can learn from it, and that's how science builds upon itself. The other piece of publication is that's how investigators build their careers. That's how they get tenure, is by publishing articles. And so there's a direct interest in terms of the investigators being able to publish. And then where kind of the legal aspect of this comes in is institutions get the benefit of tax-exempt municipal bond financing. And as part of that, there's restrictions called private use restrictions. And essentially what private use says is if this building is funded by tax-exempt municipal bonds, you agree that the work that is done in that building will be for the public benefit. And usually there's like, except for 10% of the space in there can be used for like private use where those results are not, brought to the public. And so part of complying with that requirement that the space is being used for the greater good, that's where that obligation to bring the results to the public comes in from a legal perspective.
That's really interesting because I've always wondered where that specific piece came from. I'm not a finance person, so when you mentioned this, it seems like there's a lot of wiggle room there for a sponsor. Because if I'm a pharmaceutical sponsor, I can think of a myriad of ways of responding. So one would be, well, can I be part of that 10%? My second one would be, well, let's assume that it has to be for the public good and I have to be part of that public good. Well, I'm publishing on clinicaltrials.gov. I'm bringing a drug into the market that'll be for the public good. Why does publication need to be the only way to get there?
Yep. And I would say the problem with the 10% is patients go all over the place in a facility, right? So like actually limiting where you're interacting with the patient to a specific piece of the building. But then also you have patients all over the place, right? These are hospitals. So that comes into play just from a logistical practicality. Like I've seen situations where to meet this requirement, what they do is they have one section of the lab where they just have machines stacked on top of each other to the ceiling. So they stay in that 10% space, but that's not really feasible in the realm of clinical trial agreements. Now, publications, the idea is when an academic institution does a publication, it's unbiased, right? And the one of the big kind of pillars of publication for academic institution is that those that we partner with do not have the ability to approve the publications that the academic institution is going to make, because those that we partner with have different interests than just bringing the brass facts to the table. Meaning a pharmaceutical company may not be so motivated to do an academic publication if the results of the clinical trial were unfavorable to them. Another example the results are posted on NIH, right? That's a different story. But another example I would do here is a lot of academic institutions do collaborations where they analyze government programs, okay? If you analyze a government program and you come out with results that are negative about that government program, the politician who spearheaded that or is a champion of it, it makes them look bad, right? And so from their perspective, if your results are negative, they don't really want that to be published. And so the academic institutions need to maintain the freedom that regardless of the results, we're going to make sure that they get out there to the public in this way. And the other thing I would say is when you do an academic publication through one of these journals, there's an extensive peer review process. And that peer review process adds additional value to the quality of publication. Now, when sponsors publish, they're using investigators from these sites anyway who go through that peer review process as well, but they're doing that through the investigators. So I think that's another aspect of doing it through the academic publication, is that guarantees that rigorous peer review process.
So somehow this conversation has become about publishing, which I truly enjoy because it's a fun conversation. But I'm gonna challenge you in a few of those.
Okay,
things.
Sure.
So the first position is the allegation that the information would be is unbiased. I would argue that everyone, all of us, it doesn't matter who you are, has your own bias. You have your own bias by definition. So the argument that there's no bias is an unfair argument. The question is there a specific bias you're trying to avoid? So I think that's my first thought. My second thought would be, let's assume, arguendo, that there is there's a pot of money. There is a possibility of a bias, but not evidence of bias itself. I think that's the other part of it. So I think there's a distinction between presence of bias and possibility of bias. And in this specific instance, we're talking about possibility of bias. So the idea that a pharmaceutical company, and we'll pick on pharmaceutical companies because why not? Like, they have enough people to defend them if they need to. If a pharmaceutical company is alleged to have bias, number one, you can call them out on it. We can have appropriate disclosures to address that bias. And I think the fact is that in the end, when it gets put out, you still have to go through a level of peer review that you talked about a few seconds ago, because you are required to, like, no serious journal just sort of publishes your data anymore. They require that it go through serious public review. The other piece of this is when you're thinking about bias, you're thinking about publication, you've got numerous requirements now, whether you're talking about the Declaration of Helsinki, whether you're talking about EMA Policy 70, there is a requirement that your data all gets published. In fact, I've worked personally on creating policies for large pharma, which says that all of our data, doesn't matter what it is, our results get published, and good or bad, it comes out. So is that assertion of bias and hiding results still valid, or was this more of a carryover from, say, 2009, when this was a real concern?
I think the point you made about perceived bias versus actual bias, or potential bias, not even perceived bias, but potential bias versus actual bias is an important one. And I think, where the truth is even though academic institutions on the vast majority of these industry-sponsored clinical trial, not on all of them, they're demanding publication rights, they very infrequently actually publish in their individual capacity, right? What you generally see is that they're investigators or authors on the multi-site publication. And so some of this is more of a optical thing than something in terms of I
just put a disclaimer, so that's helpful for you in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an idea that if the results are not favorable, they will make it available on clinicaltrials.gov. Right. But they may not want to do a publication in the Journal of Science, right? And so another aspect of this are case studies. Sometimes an investigator wants to publish on a particular patient because there was something interesting that happened with that particular patient. And a pharmaceutical company, that may not be something that is of interest to them in the same way. So I agree with you that there's a lot of laws and regulations that when publication does occur, and whether you do the ICMJE, publication requirements, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff to ensure that when you do publish, it's not biased. But I think it's kind of looked at as a fail-safe for the universities, as this is a way that we'll be able to ensure that the results get out there, no matter what the interests of the pharmaceutical company become.
But I hear that position, and I think it's a thought process. I think it's a valid thought process, but I think it's short-sighted. And the reason I think it's short-sighted is not because I don't think academic institutions should have the right to do that. It's coming more from the position of a fear that's not fair, in that I know a lot of investigators, and most of them have an anti-industry bias anyways. So if you take the position that these investigators themselves have an anti-industry bias, is it fair for investigators who have an anti-industry bias to take money from industry and then publish something that they're saying they have the right to publish anyways? Which I think is a weird dichotomy to face. So I think that is the first thought that goes through my head. But I'd let you respond to that first.
Yeah, I mean, so you made the point that everybody has biases, right? And so I think that just is what it is, right? And
Right.
so it's not that the academic publications may not have those bleed into it, just like anything human produced
Right.
may. But I think when what we would say to that is an investigator really has no vested interest in whether that drug is a successful drug in the marketplace. What the investigator is going to have an interest in is, does it help my patient or not, right? Now, if they had
hold on, that's not fair.
Okay.
Because you also said that they have an interest in publishing.
Yep.
So it's not whether it's useful to my patient, is it useful to my career? So if you're
Well,
establishing go ahead.
no, because
Okay.
in the vast majority of these situations, the PI doesn't publish in their individual capacity, right? Publication is how they build their careers and get tenure. But in the vast majority of these situations, they're not actually publishing, right? And so the point is the pharmaceutical company has a vested interest in that drug making it to the market, the clinical trial being successful from a financial perspective, and them being able, and the argument would be made that the PI doesn't have that same type of thing. And maybe a comparison that's not an apples to apples, but maybe an apples to oranges comparison is in the realm of subject injury.
Sure.
One of the conversations you get into frequently is who determines causation in the situation of subject injury. And that's a similar kind of premise. The sponsor has a financial incentive to say, nope, that's not a subject injury that we have to reimburse for because it saves the money. The doctor doesn't. The doctor is going to get paid by insurance, or the doctor, and the doctor's not getting paid. It's the institution that's going to get paid by insurance or going to get paid from the pharmaceutical company, right? So not an exactly apples to apples, but the point is that's a similar type of situation where you're protecting not because any bias may come at play, but just in the situation that it does.
You raised this other idea, which I thought was interesting as well. You talked about case study publication. And it's an interesting concept, right? This idea that in the context of a clinical trial, a physician and investigator should be able to publish something that they saw as an interesting case study. Let's assume a randomized double-blinded, placebo-controlled, multi-center, multinational trial, because that's the gold standard that we're all aiming for. It goes back to the question you just raised around causation, but and this has become a much more technical conversation than I expected, which is funny to me. I thought we were going to just sort of talk in general, but
my bad if I've taken us down the rabbit hole.
Oh no, I love it. This is why I enjoy these conversations. No, but I was the point I was making was when we're talking about case studies, it's especially difficult for a PI to really know whether that case study is fair. And it becomes unfair for a PI who doesn't know if the subject actually received drug or placebo, and doesn't know if this is causation or correlation, to publish on something that that applies to one subject. So how do we reconcile that? How do you, as someone who represents sites on a routine basis, who spent so much time on the site side, when sponsors push back on something like this, how do you kind of go, yeah, but?
Yep. So what I would say two things. I think the sponsor is inherently protected from bad publications because the PI has just as much to risk as they do if they do a scientifically unsound publication, right? That is going whereas scientifically sound publications will help their careers. If they have a scientifically unsound publication, that is going to damage their careers, right? Their peers are going to see that and challenge them on it. The other thing I would say is a site's ability to publish is very much connected to the sponsor, because the way the publication process works is initially there's going to be a 12 to 24 month delay after completion of the trial at all sites, so that the sponsor gets that first crack at doing the multi-site publication. And then after that, if the site wants to publish on their own, they have to submit it to the sponsor for review prior to that. The sponsor gets to ensure that all their confidential information, except for study results, are removed. And the sponsor gets to further delay the publication if there's anything patentable in the publication. And there's also, during that review, the sponsor gets to make comments and provide feedback to the investigator. And what the sites will agree to, they can agree to approval, but what they can say is that they'll agree to consider all that feedback in good faith. And maybe even sometimes if there's a disagreement about conclusions, sites will agree to meet with the pharmaceutical company to discuss it prior to submitting the final manuscript for publication. So I would argue that there's kind of that inherent alignment that bad publications hurts both the investigator and the sponsor, and that the site's ability to publish is very much a process that involves the sponsor as well.
I think there's a difference in impact. It helps the likelihood that someone's going to call out an individual investigator is much lower than the impact on a sponsor from a bad publication. As we just discussed, if there is bias, that bias is on the pharma company because of the impact on their one product that they might be pulling out. So I hear you. I'm not sure I necessarily agree, but I think that it's a valid thought process. So I think it's obviously a site's perspective on something, which I think is really, really valid. The idea that we are now in a place where we could talk about publications, and I could really take it into some of the other, like the 10 other topics you and I discussed we'd get into, but it sounds like this is about publications right now. What is your opinion? Have you had a chance to play around with some of the artificial intelligence things that are out there?
Like ChatGPT?
Yeah, like ChatGPT.
I have. I did. My sister and I did ChatGPT about my dad, who is still alive, but ChatGPT told us he died in 2020. So that's a funny aside to that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting, but mostly because, first of all, are you sure? Because ChatGPT 3 knows everything, right?
I know. Well, I did call him afterwards. I said, "Sir, you're still alive? Okay, all right, we're okay."
Do you see a future where the site develops the data and a ChatGPT 3 or something else excludes the pharma company and creates its own write-up automatically and sends this type of raw data? Would you be in favor of that as a site, or do you think that type of system lacks nuance, lacks context, and quite honestly has too high a risk of being wrong?
I think you're never gonna get out of the realm where you don't need a human review of some sort, right? To kind of validate the data integrity to a certain extent, right? I mean, that's why in the contracts, the sponsors require that the PI, look at the data and vet it before it goes into the electronic data capture system for, essentially that same reason. So I do think, and I think about this with contract negotiation too, right? Ideally, a robot could just negotiate the contract and I don't have a job anymore. But I think we're always going to need some level of human review on those contracts. Now, with that being said, I do think there is, regarding data entry, that like our regulatory coordinators are doing now. I definitely think there are AI solutions, that will come about that will make that kind of data transfer and data integration between the sites collecting it and transferring it to the data capture system of the sponsor. I see that an area that's ripe for artificial intelligence.
It's an interesting place to take it, because I think as the future, I think there's an interim where you have humans oversee it, and you have humans saying, "Oh, I like it," or "I don't like it," and clean it up, and there'll be 1,000 people at 1,000 times doing 1,000 cleanups, but eventually people realize that it's getting it more and more right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more right than what a human would do. And eventually you reach a point where you say it's now more accurate than a human. And we might move away from that. But I think the future should be very interesting. Before I go, I think what we need to do is need to have you back, and we need to discuss another topic, because we could jump into something else. But if you'd consider coming back, I'd love to have you back, and we could pick on another topic, not publication, and dig in deeper on that one. Would you be open to that?
I would love to. Nobody in my real life likes to talk about this stuff, so I would love to come on here and talk about it.
Perfect. Ish, before we go, any parting words?
Just really want to thank you for having me on. Love the conversation. Looking forward to being back, and looking forward to presenting with you and Magi here in Philly coming up.
Looking forward to it. Talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Darshan Talks. Remember, the information we discuss is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. For additional valuable insights and updates, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter at darshantalks.com. Darshan Talks is powered by